Whitney was 67 the first time she realized her nights had become a battlefield. For years, she had brushed it off as just part of getting older, but the truth was far heavier. She would lie down at 10, exhausted from the day, only to be pulled from sleep 2, 3, sometimes 4 times by the urgent need to rush to the bathroom. Each trip felt longer than it should, her legs shaky, her heart restless, her spirit quietly breaking. She began to dread the evenings because she knew the darkness would not bring her peace, but only interruptions and fatigue. It wasn't one single night that pushed her to the edge, but rather the accumulation of too many dawns spent staring at the ceiling, her body aching, her mind foggy. One early morning, as the soft light of sunrise slipped through her curtains, she sat at the edge of her bed with tears in her eyes. The question pressed against her chest, is this how it will be for the rest of my life? For someone who had raised 3 children, worked as a teacher for 30 years, and carried the strength of an entire family, it was a frightening thought. She wasn't afraid of aging itself, but she feared losing the dignity of a good night's sleep. The breaking point came during a family dinner. Whitney had smiled, nodded, and tried to listen as her grandchildren chattered about their day, but her body was drained. Her daughter noticed the shadows under her eyes and asked quietly, "Mom, are you okay?" That question, so tender and simple, struck her harder than any symptom had. It was then she admitted out loud what she had been hiding, the nightly bathroom trips, the exhaustion, the silent fear that her health was slipping away. For the first time, she allowed herself to say, "I need help." What followed wasn't an instant cure, but the beginning of a gentle transformation. A doctor's visit confirmed what Whitney already suspected. Her bladder was sensitive, her kidneys strained, and her body crying out for balance. The doctor didn't offer her a complicated prescription. Instead, he spoke softly about small changes, choosing certain fruits in the evening, adjusting the rhythm of her daily meals, and treating her body with the same care she once gave her family. At first, Whitney doubted that something as simple as food could restore her nights, but desperation has a way of opening the heart, and she decided to try. The first weeks felt uncertain, but something inside her shifted. A handful of cherries before bedtime, a piece of fruit rich in gentle minerals, small steps that seemed too ordinary to matter, yet they did. Slowly, her body responded. The bathroom trips became fewer, her sleep deeper, her mornings less clouded by exhaustion. She began to wake, not in fear, but in gratitude. One evening, as she tucked herself into bed, she realized she was no longer bracing for the night. Instead, she felt a calm she hadn't known in years. When Whitney later shared her story with me, it wasn't only about fruits or remedies, it was about hope. She looked at her grandchildren with clearer eyes, laughed more freely, and carried herself with a lighter step. And in her quiet voice, she said something I'll never forget. It wasn't just about sleeping through the night, it was about believing that life still holds peace for me, even now. Whitney's nights had become an unpredictable storm. Even when her body begged for rest, the interruptions stole away her peace. She remembered one particular night when she had finally fallen into a deep, warm slumber, only to be jolted awake by that familiar urgency. She sat up in the darkness, the wooden floor cold beneath her feet, her breath uneven. The trip to the bathroom was short, but it felt endless. When she returned to bed, she stared at the ceiling, unable to slip back into the comfort of sleep. It was these moments, quiet but heavy, that carved deep shadows under her eyes and etched fatigue into her spirit. For weeks, she told no one. She managed smiles at Sunday service, laughed with neighbors, and even hosted family dinners, though her body longed for stillness. But exhaustion carries a weight that cannot be hidden forever. One afternoon, while folding laundry, her hands trembled. A sudden wave of dizziness forced her to sit down on the edge of the bed. She closed her eyes, whispering to herself, "I can't keep living like this." Her pride, once so strong, was slowly giving way to fear. She wondered how many others carried the same silent burden. Her turning point came in the softest of ways. During a routine checkup, she finally confessed her restless nights to Dr. Ramirez, the physician she had trusted for nearly 20 years. He leaned forward, his expression warm but serious, and said, "Whitney, your body is telling you something. This isn't just about waking up, it's about the way your bladder and kidneys are working together." She braced herself for a prescription, but instead he offered her a story. He spoke of another patient, a woman in her 70s, who had struggled the same way until she began adding a simple fruit to her evenings. Cherries. At first, Whitney was skeptical. Cherries, she remembered them only as sweet summer treats from her childhood, something her father used to buy at the farmer's market. How could such a small thing change the long, heavy nights she endured? But Dr. Ramirez explained gently, in the tone of a father sharing wisdom with his child, that cherries carried natural compounds, melatonin, that helped the body find its rhythm of rest. More than a snack, they were a quiet ally for sleep. That night, Whitney placed a small bowl of cherries on her kitchen counter. She ate them slowly, the juice bright on her tongue, and felt a memory stirring, long afternoons beneath the cherry trees with her sister, their laughter carried by the wind. For a moment, she felt lighter. When she finally slipped into bed, she whispered a silent hope. Maybe tonight would be different. The change didn't happen all at once. The first night, she still woke twice, but her sleep felt deeper in between. By the third night, the pattern shifted. Only once did she rise. And by the end of the week, Whitney woke at dawn with a surprise she hadn't felt in years: energy. She stood at her window, watching the sunlight bathe her garden, and smiled. It was small, yes, but it was real. Her daughter noticed first. At their next dinner, she commented on the softness returning to Whitney's face, the way her laughter seemed less forced. "You seem lighter," she said with a smile. Whitney hesitated before sharing her secret, half embarrassed that it was something so ordinary. "Cherries," she admitted, almost shyly. But the truth was, it wasn't just cherries. It was the choice to believe her body could still change, even at 67. It was the decision to listen, to try, to hope again. That evening, Whitney wrote a single line in her journal: "Tonight, I believe I can rest." And for the first time in months, she meant it. Whitney didn't brag about sleeping a little longer. She guarded it like a candle in wind. The mornings felt softer now, but the nights still had edges, especially on days when worry clung to her shoulders. She kept her cherry bowl by the sink like a promise she intended to keep. One rainy afternoon, she visited the small farmer's market near the library, drifting between stalls as the air filled with the smell of damp earth. That is where she noticed a paper bag tied with twine and a handwritten label: pumpkin seeds, lightly toasted. Later that week, she mentioned them to Dr. Ramirez while he reviewed her notes in that careful way of his. He nodded, not as a salesman for miracle cures, but as a friend who had seen small things make honest differences. "A small handful after dinner," he suggested, "not late at night. Pumpkin seeds carry magnesium. Some people find it helps their muscles settle, including the muscles that like to tense when the body is asking for rest." He spoke gently, as if placing a blanket over a restless child. "We'll keep it simple and see what your body says." Whitney brought the bag home and poured a modest portion into a shallow dish, their pale green color reminding her of spring shoots. She tasted one and felt a warmth that belonged to kitchens and family gatherings, not to pharmacies. Rather than turning it into a rule, she made it a ritual. After dinner, while the kettle murmured for a small cup of herbal tea, she'd take that handful and chew slowly at the table. She didn't need to understand everything her body understood. She only needed to listen. The quiet of the habit made her feel steadier than any instruction she'd ever had. On the fourth evening, her daughter stopped by with the grandchildren, tracking in faint footprints of laughter and mud. "What's new, Mom?" her daughter asked, eyeing the little dish with a smile. Whitney shrugged, equal parts shy and hopeful. "I'm practicing small things," she said. The children begged for a taste, and after making them promise to brush their teeth, she let them try a few, turning the moment into a gentle ceremony the whole family could feel. That night the rain came easy, tapping the roof like a metronome. Whitney dimmed the lights earlier and let the house grow calm around her, like a lake settling after a tossed stone. She put away the phone before the first yawn arrived, washed her cup, and moved slowly, bedroom, lamp, covers, each step an invitation to her body to follow. She woke once, earlier than usual, and went back to sleep with the same softness you use to close a book you love. Morning found her not triumphant, but certain. Of course, there were stubborn nights. A stitched seam of worry could still snag on old habits, and the mind does not always accept peace just because we've offered it. On those nights, Whitney returned to the basics: cherries waiting like evening stars, a palm of seeds at dusk, and a promise to herself to drink most of her water earlier in the day. She kept a small journal on the nightstand and wrote one line before sleep. Nothing complicated, just a gratitude or a sentence she wanted to carry into the dark. The words felt like a hand she could hold. Dr. Ramirez never congratulated her as if she'd climbed a mountain. He simply noticed. "Your face looks rested," he said during her next visit, the way a neighbor might remark on a freshly swept porch. Whitney talked about the seeds then, bashfully, as if revealing a secret recipe. He smiled the kind of smile that comes from 1,000 quiet successes witnessed in ordinary rooms. "Keep listening," he said. "Your body is already telling you what it likes." One Sunday after church, Whitney lingered by the door and watched the congregation spill into daylight. A friend touched her elbow and said, "You look different, lighter somehow." Whitney could have said pumpkin seeds or melatonin or routine, but she simply answered, "I'm learning to prepare for sleep the way I prepare for guests." It was true. She had started treating bedtime as something to welcome, not endure. And in that shift, from bracing to inviting, her nights began to belong to her again. That evening, she placed the small dish on the table and listened to the house exhale. The window held the last pale blue of the day, and the quiet was the kind you don't dare disturb with big plans. Whitney ate her seeds, rinsed her cup, and felt in her bones the slow, reassuring hum of a body learning new rhythms. Not cured, not perfect, just gently turning toward rest. And for a woman who had once feared the night, that turn felt like a miracle measured in small, faithful steps. Whitney's life moved with more ease now, though her nights were still a puzzle. Some evenings she felt almost normal again, while others reminded her how fragile sleep could be. Yet even in the uneven rhythm, she discovered something new. Her mornings carried less dread. She had begun to believe that peace was not a destination but a practice, built in tiny acts of care. That belief opened her eyes to other possibilities, other ways her body might respond to gentleness instead of struggle. The idea arrived not in a doctor's office, but in her daughter's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. Her daughter was making a simple salad, the kind with bright greens, a squeeze of lemon, and slices of cucumber so thin the light passed through them. Whitney had always eaten cucumbers as a summer snack, never giving them more thought than the crunch they added. But her daughter, almost offhandedly, said, "They're good for keeping the body calm at night, lots of water, but also potassium. That helps ease the pressure on the bladder." Whitney smiled, half skeptical and half charmed. Could something so ordinary carry such weight? That night, she decided to try. She cut the cucumber into cool circles and placed them neatly on a small plate beside her evening tea. As she bit into the crisp freshness, memories came rushing back. Picnics by the lake, the scent of sunscreen, her children laughing with mouths full of sandwiches and slices of cucumber. It felt less like medicine and more like an old friend returning. The ease of the ritual mattered as much as the cucumber itself. It was not a burden, but a gift she gave her body at the end of the day. Over the weeks that followed, Whitney noticed something subtle but undeniable. Her late-night urgency lessened, the tug on her bladder not as sharp or insistent. She still woke occasionally, but there were nights when she made it until morning, her body carrying her through until dawn without interruption. Each time it happened, she awoke in disbelief, lying still for a moment to be certain. She felt almost childlike in her joy, grateful for something so simple that many take for granted, an unbroken night of rest. Her family noticed the difference too. At breakfast, she no longer sat slumped over her coffee, struggling to keep her eyes open. Instead, she leaned forward in conversation, her laughter carrying further than before. Her grandchildren teased her gently, saying she was catching up with them in energy. Whitney laughed along, though deep inside, she felt something even more profound. She was catching up with herself, with the woman she used to be before sleeplessness drained her spirit. Dr. Ramirez listened carefully when she told him about the cucumbers. He nodded, pleased but not surprised. "Your body is responding," he said softly. "It's telling you that hydration and minerals matter more than you realized. Sometimes the simplest foods are the strongest allies." He looked at her with kind eyes, the way someone looks when they know healing isn't only physical but also emotional. Whitney understood. This wasn't about cucumbers alone, it was about trust, about relearning how to partner with her own body. One evening, as she prepared her small plate, Whitney paused at the window. The world outside was quiet, the sky a soft canvas of fading light. She thought of all the nights she had once feared, how she had braced herself against them like a storm. Now she was learning to enter them gently with offerings of cherries, seeds, cucumbers, ordinary things turned sacred by the hope she poured into them. Her journal entry that night was simple. I am no longer afraid of the dark. Whitney had begun to trust her body again, but even the best routines are sometimes tested. One night, after a particularly busy day helping her neighbor in the garden, she fell into bed without her evening rituals. No cherries, no seeds, no cucumbers, just exhaustion. She told herself it wouldn't matter for one night. But when the clock struck 2, she was back on the cold floor, shuffling toward the bathroom, her chest tight with disappointment. By morning, her mood had sunk, and she felt the familiar heaviness creep back. It wasn't just the lack of sleep, it was the fear that all her progress could vanish so easily. During her next visit, Dr. Ramirez noticed her tired eyes. He didn't scold her, but he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands as though he were holding something fragile. "Whitney," he said, "your body is not just muscles and organs, it's also your mind. Anxiety feeds the bladder, stress tenses the muscles, and worry steals your rest before the night even begins." His words settled slowly, like pebbles sinking into water. Whitney had always thought of health as physical, but here was her doctor reminding her that the mind could be as restless as the body. She carried those words home and began to notice the truth of them. On nights when she replayed old worries, her bills, her children's choices, the ache in her knees, her trips to the bathroom multiplied. But on evenings when she sat with her tea, watching the sunset fade without forcing thoughts to come or go, her body seemed calmer, her sleep deeper. It was a quiet revelation. Perhaps her bladder wasn't the enemy, but the messenger, carrying her stress in ways she hadn't wanted to see. Her daughter noticed the shift too. One evening, she found Whitney sitting on the porch with her journal, the twilight folding gently around her shoulders. "What are you writing?" her daughter asked. Whitney closed the book with a smile. "Not much," she replied, "just a few lines to clear the clutter in here," and she tapped her forehead. They shared a silence that felt more healing than any advice could. It wasn't about solving everything, it was about softening the sharp edges before stepping into the night. Whitney began to shape her evenings differently. She dimmed the lights earlier, turned the television off before it could fill her mind with noise, and sat quietly with a small bowl of warm milk infused with nutmeg, a trick she remembered from her own mother. The comfort of the drink, paired with the act of slowing down, eased her into sleep like a gentle tide pulling her toward shore. On nights she combined it with her other rituals, she sometimes slept all the way until sunrise. When that happened, she whispered gratitude before her feet even touched the floor. The grandchildren noticed too. "Grandma, you don't look tired anymore," one of them said as they sat together in the living room, building towers of wooden blocks. Whitney smiled, her heart swelling with both pride and humility. It wasn't just about being awake for them, it was about being present. She could listen longer, laugh louder, and hold them without her arms trembling from fatigue. Her body was finding balance, but more importantly, her spirit was learning to rest. That night, Whitney wrote in her journal, "I am more than my worries. I am allowed to let them go before bed." The words felt like a promise not only to herself, but to the generations watching her. She was no longer surviving her nights, she was reclaiming them, one calm breath at a time. Whitney's progress felt like a fragile but beautiful thread, delicate yet strong enough to hold her nights together. By early summer, she was proud of how far she had come. Most mornings she woke with steady energy, enough to tend to her flowers, visit with her church friends, and even volunteer a few afternoons at the local library. But life has a way of testing even the most hopeful heart. It happened during a family gathering on the 4th of July. The house was filled with laughter, the smell of grilled food, and the constant patter of children running through the yard. Whitney, swept up in the joy of it all, forgot herself for a while. She drank soda for the first time in months, enjoyed a slice of pie with whipped cream, and sat outside long after her usual bedtime. For a few hours, she felt decades younger, alive, carefree, carried by the noise and warmth of family. But as night fell and the house grew quiet, her body reminded her of its limits. She woke 3 times before dawn, her bladder insistent, her heart sinking with each step down the hallway. The next morning, she hid her exhaustion behind a smile, not wanting to dampen the children's joy. But her daughter saw through it. Later that week, as they shared coffee on the porch, her daughter placed a gentle hand on hers and said, "Mom, I know you want to enjoy life, but you don't have to give up everything to stay well. You just need to find balance." Whitney nodded, feeling the sting of truth. She realized that health wasn't about perfection, but about learning how to return to herself after every stumble. A few days later, she returned to Dr. Ramirez, confessing the setback with a sheepish laugh. He didn't scold her. Instead, he leaned forward with the calm of someone who had heard the same story many times. "Whitney, your kidneys are your silent workers," he said softly. "When you overload them with sugar or caffeine, they protest. But there are foods that can help support them, keeping your body in balance." He mentioned blueberries, small, dark jewels filled with compounds that protect the kidneys and calm inflammation. Try adding them in the morning or with a light evening snack. Think of them as guardians rather than indulgences. Whitney bought a basket of blueberries the very next day. She remembered her husband planting a bush years ago in their backyard, though she hadn't tended it in a long time. Now, each blueberry tasted like both medicine and memory, sweet, tart, alive with possibility. She began folding them into her yogurt at breakfast, saving a few for the evenings when she needed comfort without regret. Slowly, she noticed her body's gratitude, less bloating, calmer nights, fewer interruptions. Her grandchildren quickly joined in. "Grandma's blueberry bowls," they called them, crowding around her kitchen table after school. Whitney laughed as they stained their lips purple, their giggles echoing through the house. What started as a quiet health choice became a ritual of joy, binding her family closer together. She realized then that healing could be shared, that her small practices could ripple outward, teaching her grandchildren about gentleness and care without a single lecture. One Saturday morning, Whitney walked to her backyard and found the old blueberry bush still alive, its branches heavy with fruit. She picked them slowly, the sun warm on her shoulders, and felt tears welling in her eyes. The bush had endured neglect, storms, and seasons of silence, yet it had continued to grow. She saw herself in its branches. Not perfect, not unbroken, but still offering sweetness to those she loved. That night, as she placed a small bowl of blueberries on her nightstand, Whitney whispered, "I am stronger than my setbacks." Sleep came gently, wrapping her in the quiet assurance that even mistakes could lead her back to healing. By late summer, Whitney's nights no longer felt like a battlefield. They were not flawless, but they were hers again, calmer, softer, and no longer ruled by fear. The changes she had embraced, cherries, pumpkin seeds, cucumbers, warm milk, blueberries, had carried her gently back to herself. But there was still something missing, something less tangible than food or routine. It wasn't until one quiet evening, while sitting alone in her living room, that she understood what it was. The house was still, the clock ticking faintly in the background when she opened her old photo album. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and thyme, filled with snapshots of birthdays, graduations, and family vacations. She lingered on a picture of her husband smiling at her from a picnic years ago. The grief of his absence pressed against her chest, and she realized that part of her sleeplessness had never been about her bladder at all. It had been about loneliness. Nights were long because she carried them alone, with no one beside her to whisper that everything was going to be okay. The realization came not as a weight, but as a release. She closed the album gently and whispered into the quiet, "I miss you, but I am still here." That night, she decided to create a ritual that wasn't about food or drink, but about heart. Before bed, she began writing letters, sometimes to her late husband, sometimes to God, sometimes simply to herself. They weren't long, often just a paragraph or two, but they poured the worries out of her mind and onto paper. Each letter felt like unburdening her spirit before stepping into sleep. At her next appointment, she shared this with Dr. Ramirez. He listened, his eyes kind, and said, "Whitney, the body listens to the heart more than we realize. When you unburden your spirit, your body follows." He didn't need to explain it further. She felt it every morning when she woke, lighter than she had in years. The practice became as important to her as any fruit or seed, and perhaps even more so. Her daughter noticed a deeper glow in her. "You look peaceful, Mom," she said one afternoon as they sat in the garden. Whitney smiled, not with pride, but with gratitude. "I think I finally learned how to end my day," she replied softly. The grandchildren noticed too, not in words, but in the way she had energy to play longer, to laugh more, to simply be present. Whitney was no longer surviving her nights, she was thriving in them. One evening, after her journal entry and her evening fruit, Whitney stood at her window and watched the stars blink awake. She realized that the darkness she once feared had become a companion, a signal of rest rather than anxiety. She whispered to herself, "I am whole, I am safe, and I am ready to sleep." When she slipped into bed, she felt no resistance, only surrender. Her journey had not been about finding a single cure. It had been about small, faithful choices, fruits, seeds, quiet drinks, gentle writing, that together created a life she could rest in. Whitney understood now that sleep was not a prize given to the lucky, but a gift she could cultivate with care night after night. And as she closed her eyes that evening, she knew she had not only regained her rest, she had rediscovered the part of herself that believed peace was possible. Whitney's story reminds us that change does not always arrive with thunder, but often in whispers. She began her journey weighed down by restless nights, convinced that her body had betrayed her. Each trip to the bathroom felt like a thief stealing her peace, leaving her drained and afraid of what growing older might mean. Yet through small choices, a bowl of cherries, a handful of seeds, a plate of cucumbers, she discovered that healing could be gentle, steady, and deeply personal. It wasn't only her body that transformed, it was her spirit. With every ritual she embraced, she learned to soften the fear that had long clung to her nights. She discovered that health is not about chasing perfection, but about listening to her body, to her heart, and to the quiet wisdom of her own life. The blueberries, the warm milk, even the words she wrote in her journal became more than remedies. They became reminders that dignity, rest, and hope are still possible, no matter the number of years behind us. And so, as you reflect on Whitney's path, perhaps you can find your own gentle practices, small habits that bring comfort, calm, and renewal. They need not be complicated or grand. Often, the smallest choices carry the deepest power. Like Whitney, you may find that a single moment of care tonight can lead to a morning filled with gratitude tomorrow. As we close, remember this: our nights are not meant to be feared, but welcomed. Peace is not beyond reach. It waits in the quiet corners of our choices, in the love we show ourselves, and in the hope we refuse to surrender. May you too find rest waiting faithfully for you in the dark.